Good morning and welcome to week 2 of Eco 330. Let me do my video response. I've done last week's grading. Let me start there. So for our Module 1 assignment, I did a check plus grading. I'm going to do this throughout the semester. This week, the way that worked is if you got question 2 correct, you got a check plus. Otherwise, you get a check. Check is 4 out of 5. A check plus is 5 out of 5, or 80%, 100% for a check plus. So the check plus question this week was the one about Thomas Carlyle and the dismal science. So what I wanted to see for that check plus is that you correctly identify Carlyle as the person who coined the term the dismal science, and that he coined it because of his views on slavery. Carlyle called economics a dismal science because from his perspective, he thought it was a moral imperative to force people to work, especially people of color, against their will, right? Economists were arguing against that point. Economists were arguing that slavery is a bad idea and that what we see people do reveals something about what they value, and then what they value is important, that people have some equal moral weight regardless of race. Cool. So I saw a lot along those lines. I was expecting you to basically Google your way to this blog post, The Secret History of the Dismal Science by David Levy and Sandra Pert. Very interesting stuff. Definitely recommend going back and reading this if you didn't the first time. Quick aside, this class involves a lot of reading and writing, so it's a good opportunity to practice your writing skills. 5 years from now, when you're out in the job market, your understanding of the history of economics as a discipline isn't going to be super valuable, but your ability to write clearly is. Mostly I saw pretty good writing. Everyone could use some practice. I certainly could use some practice. There were some cases where the writing was really hard to read, and something like the Hemingway editor is a very good way to help you to write better. So my advice would be, as you're doing your assignments, just copy paste it into hemingwayapp.com, and it will highlight things like, we could do better writing by not using these adverbs, or we could get rid of the passive voice and be clearer in what we're saying. So definitely encourage you to do that. Also saw many missing assignments, missing submissions, including partially done discussion assignments for the first week. This is a 300 level class, so I have higher expectations for you guys than I do in my principles classes. That said, I still have the same basic policy of your 2 lowest grades get dropped. So you might look in your grades and already see bright spaces marking some things as dropped. Right now it's marking the things as dropped as your first assignments. After a few weeks it'll look more normal. Right? It will drop your actual lowest grade instead of just the only grade that you've got in the grade book right now. So your 2 lowest get dropped automatically, but almost half the class has already used one of those for the Module 1 assignment. So now you've only got 1 dropped assignment left. That's your insurance policy. Make sure that you don't waste it on week 2. Save that up for when you actually need it, like when someone in your family gets sick or you have a job interview or something. For the discussion, I saw mostly pretty good discussions. That was nice. Seeing this back and forth is what we need, especially since we're an asynchronous class. This class content really works best with sort of a Socratic dialogue type approach. Really works best in the room, but since we're not all in the room together, it's important that we do the reading, we discuss the reading, and we interact with each other. So there were a few people who got grades of check minus for the discussion because they posted something, but they didn't have any responses to their classmates. So make sure that you're doing that in the future. And that's going to be a lot easier if you're posting your initial post early so that there is time for people to foster a discussion. We're not going to have an effective discussion at Sunday between 11 p.m. and 1 a.m. on Monday, right? So if you leave this off to the last moment, we're going to get a lower quality class than we should have. So it's important that we do our work relatively early. All right. Another tool that might be useful for helpful writing is Deirdre McCloskey's book, Economical Writing. This is also nice because it is a nice economical book. It's very slim, very cheap. The newer version, $14. You can find an older version for probably a couple bucks, $3.78. This is the copy I've got on my shelf, and it's a very short book. Each chapter is basically a couple pages making some point, but definitely a good way to hone your writing skills. It's sort of targeted at economists, but it is just as valid for any sort of writing. So check that out. Economical Writing by Deirdre McCloskey. All right, so back to the assignment itself. We've got 3 other questions besides the dismal science question. What is methodology? Why should you read the classics? And why not read the classics? All right, so what is methodology? In a nutshell, it's the how of our discipline. It's how we do economics. How economists study choice under scarcity is economic methodology. How chemists study the interaction of different molecules is chemistry methodology. Different disciplines have different methodologies because we have different things we're studying. And of course, methodology changes over time. This is a big part of the reason for this class, is that you can see some of the background. You can see how methodology changes, in particular going from the 1700s, when things are just done on paper and pencil, into the 21st century where we've got computers, right? Our how has changed dramatically in the last couple hundred years. One student pointed out that we might have qualitative and quantitative methodology. Right? Within economics, we have a ton of different sets of methodology. Within subdisciplines, we have different methodologies. Experimental economists do things differently than econometricians, who do things differently than economic historians. But methodology in general is just that set of methods that we use. And by we, I might mean we in a narrow subdiscipline, or economics more broadly. Right? So economics more broadly, we have some shared things like methodological individualism. We start with the assumption that only individuals choose, because humans don't work like the Power Rangers. We can't just merge together into one giant thing that does something. We're all independently doing our own things. Another thing about this is that it's kind of like the air we breathe. Something that is worth looking up, you can find an audio version of this, is the, what's the word I'm looking for? The speech, "This is Water." Not important for economics, and I'm not going to test you on it, but valuable for just human life experience. So he starts this speech, this commencement address, that's the word I was looking for, this commencement address with this story of these 2 fish hanging out, and the older fish swims past and says, "Hey boys, how's the water?" And the first 2 fish have no idea what water is, because if you're a fish, you've spent your entire life in water, you don't know, it's invisible. For you and I, the air around us is invisible. We wouldn't know it unless someone had gone out of their way in 3rd grade to teach us that air is a thing. Likewise, methodology, or the assumptions that we make as economists, can kind of fade into the background. They can become like the water the fish swim in but don't notice, or the air that we breathe that's invisible, that we wouldn't even know was there if we didn't consciously think about it. So thinking about that in terms of economic methodology, being conscious and curious and looking for things, is how we'll notice what sort of assumptions that we might be implicitly making that may or may not be useful assumptions. All right, so why read the classics? The big thing is there's sometimes just good ideas that got missed, that we forgot. Reading older works can give us new perspectives, new to us, even though they are older perspectives. And again, it helps us to question assumptions, right? It's sort of the easiest way that you might plausibly question assumptions because it puts you into a time frame. Sorry. Come on, Ted. Sorry, this is Ted looking for attention. Looking at past economists' work sort of lets you see how economists did things before these assumptions were quite so ingrained and entrenched. By looking at what the field looked like before, say, formal mathematical models became the normal way to do economics, we get a way to kind of think about that assumption and ask what it's giving to us and what it costs us. One thing I liked is in the Betke reading. So a couple things. Here I've got highlighted an answer to the second question, why not read the classics? But he used the phrase, the body of thought found in the classics retains intellectual evolutionary potential until the insights within it are fully exploited. Sorry, come on, Ted. So, here's a metaphor that might make this easier to understand. Let's say you've got some sort of a sports league, right? Basketball, football, soccer, whatever. You've got this competitive environment where different teams are using different strategies to try to beat each other. So let's say Team A uses strategy X this year, whatever that might mean. This might mean, faking a pass to the right and moving to the left or whatever, right? They've got some strategy they use. Team B is going to adjust their strategy in response. So next season, we're going to have the possibility of strategy X kind of implicitly incorporated into different teams' strategies. This is this notion that economics, modern economics, will sort of embed the older insights into it. But what about after like 30 years, right? So next season, all the teams are ready for strategy X, but 30 years down the road, their strategy has continued to evolve, and so strategy X is sort of in the background there, but it might have faded into the background far enough that if a team was to try strategy X again, or some variation on it, they might find that that strategy suddenly is very, very effective again. Right? It was effective the first year, it stopped being effective the second year when other teams started to respond, but then 30 years down the road, it might be effective again because the environment has changed. The environment in this case is the physical environment, but it's also the strategies played by all the other teams. So as one team changes its strategy, it changes the environment for everyone else. They adjust to that new environment, and that initial change gets embedded into the near future, but further on, it might again have some evolutionary potential. So the moral of that metaphor is the value of a strategy depends on the environment in which it's used, and the environment is in part determined by the strategies that people are using. Likewise, in economics or any other discipline, insights from the past might have new value when applied to the new world. And since the world is constantly changing and adapting, there's always a new world to try and plug old insights into. Right? Now, these old insights, they might be obsolete, they might be wrong. We're talking about like the labor theory of value. That is, thoroughly discredited. Something like that, we're not going to get some new evolutionary potential, although we might need to engage with those ideas because despite it being an old, obsolete idea, sometimes these old, obsolete ideas stick around. So this is another reason we might want to think about reading the classics, or let's even call them the non-classics, the things that are old, that some people think are classics, but are maybe leading us astray. So when people get caught up in old ideas that don't have this positive evolutionary potential, then it's important for the rest of us to go and understand their arguments so that we can pull them apart and hopefully correct things. All right, so that's a lot of reasons to think about reading the classics. I would encourage you, if you haven't, or even if you have, to go back and at least skim again this Ken Boulding essay after Samuelson, who needs Adam Smith? So that is why read the classics? Why not read the classics? Well, the short answer is opportunity cost. You got a lot of things you got to learn, and there's only so much time to go around. Right? This is why I haven't read The Wealth of Nations from cover to cover. Although, as an economist, I kind of have some sort of an obligation to. On the other hand, there's a million other things that I want to learn, and I just don't have time to do it all. So a class like this helps to force me to go back and read some of that old stuff. But unless we had a class on The Wealth of Nations, well, I'm going to have to pick and choose. So even with all these good reasons to read the classics, there is some opportunity cost. And on the margin, what that means is that I read less of Adam Smith than might be ideal. Why not read the classics? Another reason is just that it's hard. Again, the opportunity cost, if it's old English that's hard to read from our modern perspective, that just increases the marginal cost of getting these valuable insights from the old economists. This cost, of course, goes down once you're reading economists in the 70s, the 1970s instead of the 1770s. But nonetheless, right, cost is an argument. And then, as we said earlier, we hope that the best ideas from the past have already been embedded into the current mainstream of economics. And in some cases, we definitely do get that, right? We get the notion of incentives already embedded in current economics. So we hope that all the important things will be there and all the mistakes will be left in the past. But, here you are. You're signed up for Eco 330. We're committed for the next 14 weeks to be doing this stuff, so let's not worry about why not read the classics and focus on why we do read the classics. All right, in any case, this past week, what we were doing was mostly emphasizing some groundwork, thinking about how we know what we know. So these videos from a philosopher on the philosophy of science, I hope gave you some insight. I want to set the stage here. We'll come back to these concepts later in the semester, but I wanted to plant some seeds in your brain so that as we're going through from Adam Smith to the current day, that you're thinking about, how do we know that Adam Smith was doing good economics? What does it mean for that to be the case? How do I identify if someone's doing good econ or bad econ or good science or bad science? How do we know what they're saying is true? Just because someone says something's true or just because it's in the textbook or some authority figure tells us it's true, that's not enough, right? We have to philosophize. We have to think our way through this. So keep that stuff in the background because we are going to be going through old economists and people have had a chance to respond and to pick apart those arguments for sometimes a couple hundred years. But putting ourselves into the perspective of thinking through, from the past, understanding what constraints they were facing and to what extent they were doing a relatively good job of understanding the world around them is something that we want to keep in the back of our head as as we're doing this. Another reading here relevant to that point is Richard Feynman's famous essay Cargo Cult Science, which unfortunately is a little hard to find through these nice accessible links. Distance Learning wanted me to include links to the library, which I think is sensible, but it turns out Cargo Cult Science is a little bit easier to find just somewhere on the internet. So Google this, you'll find it. It's a fun essay. Richard Feynman's a fun author. And it gives us, again, some insight into thinking about what makes good science. How do we know what we know? All right, with that said, we are going into Module 2. So, as with the previous week, you're going to see the Module 2 overview. You're going to see a video playlist, which now will include this video after I upload it. You'll have some readings, the usual stuff. So make sure you stay on top of that stuff. Get your discussion questions or your comments in relatively early. This will have 3 videos in just a minute. All right. So if you have any questions, let me know in the usual places. By all means, take advantage of our Discord server if you've got any questions. We've got our 330 channel here. And with that said, I will let you get back to work, and I will talk to you in the future.